They made me sit in the back row like I was some kind of charity case, whispering that I didn't even belong there, until the lawyer looked straight at me and announced I was the sole heir to everything. My name is Emma Rodriguez. I'm 32 years old, and up until 3 days ago, I was just another struggling graphic designer in downtown Chicago, living paycheck to paycheck in a cramped studio apartment above a Korean restaurant. The smell of kimchi had become so familiar that I barely noticed it anymore, and my biggest worry was whether I'd have enough money to pay rent this month. I never imagined that attending my estranged great-aunt Eleanor's funeral would change my entire life in ways I couldn't even begin to comprehend. I hadn't seen Aunt Eleanor since I was maybe 8 years old, back when my mother was still alive, and our family occasionally gathered for awkward holiday dinners. Eleanor was this mysterious figure who loomed large in our family mythology, the wealthy widow who lived in that massive Victorian mansion on the North Shore, the one everyone whispered about, but no one really talked to directly. My mother always said Eleanor was difficult and set in her ways, which I later learned was family code for she didn't approve of the choices we made. Specifically, she didn't approve of my mother marrying a Mexican-American construction worker instead of someone from her social circle. When the funeral notice appeared in the Chicago Tribune last week, I almost didn't go. What was the point? I barely knew the woman, and from what I remembered, she barely acknowledged my existence during those rare family gatherings when I was a child. She'd look at me with these sharp blue eyes, nod politely when my mother introduced me, and then turn her attention to more important matters. But something, maybe guilt, maybe curiosity, maybe just the fact that she was the last connection to my mother's side of the family, made me dig out my only black dress and drive up to Winnetka that gray October morning. The funeral home was packed with people I didn't recognize. Expensive suits, designer handbags, perfectly styled hair, the kind of crowd that screamed old money and social connections. I felt completely out of place in my department store dress and worn flats, like I was wearing a costume to a party where everyone else had received a different dress code memo. As I signed the guest book with a cheap pen that barely worked, I caught snippets of conversation floating around me. Such a shame about Eleanor. Wonder what will happen to the estate. Hope she left something substantial for the Historical Society. That house must be worth millions. That's when I first saw them. The Blackwood family. Eleanor's late husband's relatives, dressed like they were attending a board meeting rather than a funeral. Margaret Blackwood, the matriarch, swept in wearing head-to-toe black Chanel, her silver hair pulled back in a perfect chignon, followed by her 2 sons, Richard and Charles, and their perfectly polished wives who looked like they'd stepped out of a country club magazine. They moved through the crowd like they owned the place, accepting condolences with practiced grace and the kind of confidence that comes from never having to worry about money. I tried to blend into the background, positioning myself near a flower arrangement where I could observe without being noticed. But Margaret's sharp eyes found me anyway, scanning the crowd like a hawk searching for prey. She approached with that smile wealthy people use when they're being polite but not particularly warm, the kind of expression that manages to be both welcoming and dismissive at the same time. "You must be Emma," she said, looking me up and down with barely concealed disapproval. "Eleanor mentioned you occasionally over the years. Such a pity you two weren't closer." The way she said it made it clear she thought it was my fault somehow, that I had failed to maintain a relationship with a woman who had never shown any interest in having one with me. After the service, which was filled with generic platitudes about Eleanor's contributions to the community and dedication to preserving Chicago's architectural heritage, everyone was invited back to Eleanor's mansion for the reading of the will. I hesitated in the parking lot, keys in hand, wondering if I should just go home to my tiny apartment and my freelance projects. But the lawyer, a distinguished man named Mr. Harrison, who looked like he'd stepped out of a 1950s movie, had specifically mentioned that my presence was requested. The mansion was even more intimidating than I remembered from my childhood visits. Towering oak trees lined the circular driveway, their bare branches reaching toward the gray sky like skeletal fingers, and the house itself looked like something out of a Gothic novel, all dark stone and tall windows that seemed to watch you as you approached. Inside, the rooms were filled with antique furniture, oil paintings of stern-faced ancestors, and the kind of inherited wealth that most people only see in movies or museum exhibits. The Blackwoods had clearly made themselves at home, clustering together in the front of the living room and speaking in low, confident tones about estate taxes and property values. Margaret had positioned herself in Eleanor's favorite armchair, like she was already claiming territory. When I walked in, the conversation stopped. All eyes turned to me, and I felt my cheeks burn with embarrassment. The first thing I noticed when Mr. Harrison called my name wasn't the shocked silence. It was the way Charles Blackwood's face went from confident to murderous in less than 3 seconds. Charles Blackwood, a man in his 50s with silver hair and cold blue eyes, actually looked annoyed that I had dared to enter what he clearly considered his domain. He turned to Mr. Harrison with the kind of authority that comes from a lifetime of having people defer to your wishes. "I'm sorry," he said, his voice carrying that particular tone wealthy people use when they're not sorry at all. "But why exactly is she here? I mean, no disrespect to Emma, but Eleanor barely knew this girl. This is really a private family matter." Mr. Harrison adjusted his wire-rimmed glasses and consulted his leather portfolio with the deliberate movements of someone who had dealt with entitled families before. "Mrs. Blackwood specifically requested that Miss Rodriguez be present for the reading. In fact, her presence is essential." Margaret gestured dismissively toward the back of the room with a wave of her manicured hand. "Well, I suppose she can sit back there if Eleanor insisted. But let's get on with this. We have dinner reservations at the club." So there I was, relegated to a folding chair in the back corner like some kind of afterthought, while the Blackwoods arranged themselves in the front row, like they were at a theater premiere waiting for their names to be called for awards. The irony wasn't lost on me. In a room full of people who considered themselves Eleanor's real family, I was the one who actually shared her blood, the one who carried her sister's genes, the one who had her same stubborn chin and dark eyes. Richard Blackwood, the younger son, kept checking his expensive watch and whispering to his wife about their flight to Aspen the next morning. Charles was already on his phone, probably with his financial advisor, discussing what to do with the windfall they all assumed was coming their way. Margaret sat like a queen holding court, occasionally nodding to acknowledge the condolences of other wealthy mourners who had followed us from the funeral home. Mr. Harrison cleared his throat and began reading the formal language of the will, his voice carrying the weight of legal authority. The Blackwoods leaned forward expectantly as he went through the preliminary statements about Eleanor's sound mind and the revocation of all previous wills. I found myself studying the room instead, the crystal chandelier that probably cost more than I made in 2 years, the Persian rugs that looked like museum pieces, the family photos on the mantelpiece that showed generations of Blackwood family gatherings, but didn't include a single picture of me or my mother. The reading seemed to go on forever, with legal terminology that made my head spin. Something about trusts and beneficiaries and charitable donations. I was starting to zone out, thinking about the graphic design project I needed to finish by Monday, when Mr. Harrison's voice suddenly cut through my wandering thoughts like a knife. "And to my great-niece, Emma Rodriguez, daughter of my beloved niece, Anna Rodriguez, the only blood relative who ever showed genuine kindness without expectation of reward, I leave my entire estate." The words seemed to hang in the air like smoke. I felt like someone had just told me I'd won the lottery while simultaneously informing me that aliens had landed on the White House lawn. It was too surreal to process. Mr. Harrison continued reading, his voice steady and professional despite the growing tension in the room. "Including the mansion at 1247 Lakeshore Drive, all financial assets, investment portfolios, jewelry, artwork, and personal property contained therein. The total estimated value of the estate is approximately $12.7 million. The room went dead silent. I could hear the grandfather clock in the hallway ticking, the sound of cars passing on the street outside, even my own heartbeat thundering in my ears. $12.7 million. I made $38,000 last year, and that was a good year. This had to be some kind of mistake, some cosmic joke that would be corrected any second now. Margaret's face went through a fascinating color transformation. White, then red, then a shade of purple I didn't know human skin could achieve. Charles shot to his feet like he'd been electrocuted, his phone clattering to the floor. "There must be some mistake," he said, his voice tight with barely controlled rage. "Eleanor always said the estate would stay in the Blackwood family. We've been managing her affairs for years. We've been taking care of her while expecting something in return," Mr. Harrison said gently, looking up from the will with eyes that had clearly seen this drama play out before. Mrs. Blackwood was very specific about her reasoning. She left a personal letter explaining her decision. He pulled out an envelope with my name written in Eleanor's distinctive handwriting. The same careful script I remembered from birthday cards she'd sent when I was very young. Richard Blackwood, who had been silent until now, stepped forward with the kind of aggressive posture that suggested he was used to intimidating people into giving him what he wanted. We'll contest this. There's no way Eleanor was in her right mind when she made this decision. She was 87 years old, probably suffering from dementia or under some kind of undue influence. Mrs. Blackwood underwent a complete psychological evaluation just 6 months ago. Mr. Harrison interrupted firmly. She was declared to be of completely sound mind and body by 3 independent physicians. I have the documentation right here, along with video testimony of her explaining her decision in detail. The room erupted like a volcano. Margaret was demanding to see the original will, her voice rising to a pitch that could probably shatter the crystal chandelier. Charles was frantically dialing his phone, presumably calling his lawyer to figure out how to overturn what he clearly saw as a catastrophic injustice. Richard's wife was crying about how unfair it all was, dabbing at her eyes with a handkerchief that probably cost more than my monthly grocery budget. Through it all, I sat frozen in my folding chair, clutching Eleanor's letter like it might disappear if I let go. The envelope felt heavy in my hands, weighted with secrets I wasn't sure I was ready to learn. "Miss Rodriguez," Mr. Harrison said, raising his voice above the chaos, "perhaps we should discuss the details in private. There are several immediate matters that require your attention, and I believe Mrs. Blackwood left specific instructions for you." As I stood up on legs that felt like they belonged to someone else, Margaret whirled around to face me. Her carefully maintained composure had completely cracked, and for the first time, I saw the real woman beneath the polished exterior. Someone who was used to getting her way and had no idea how to handle being told no. "You have no idea what you're getting yourself into," she hissed, her voice low and dangerous. "This family has secrets, obligations, responsibilities that go back generations. You can't just waltz in here and take what doesn't belong to you. Apparently, it does belong to me," I managed to say, surprised by how steady my voice sounded when everything inside me was shaking. The letter in my hands wasn't just an explanation. It was a warning that the Blackwoods had been stealing from Eleanor for years, and my mother had died because she found out. Charles stepped closer to me, and I could smell his expensive cologne mixed with something that might have been desperation or rage. His voice dropped to what he probably thought was a reasonable tone, but his eyes remained cold and calculating. "Look, Emma, let's be reasonable here. You're a nice girl, but you don't understand the complexities of managing an estate like this. There are tax implications, legal responsibilities, social obligations that come with this kind of wealth. Why don't we work out some kind of arrangement? We'll give you a fair settlement, say $500,000, and you can sign everything over to us. Everyone wins, and you won't have to deal with all the headaches that come with this kind of inheritance. $500,000. 6 months ago, that would have seemed like all the money in the world. Now, knowing it was less than 5% of what Eleanor had actually left me, it felt like an insult. The will has already been probated," Mr. Harrison interjected firmly. "Miss Rodriguez is under no obligation to negotiate anything. The estate is legally hers, and any attempts to coerce or intimidate her could result in serious legal consequences." I looked around the room at these people who had treated me like an unwanted intruder just minutes ago, who were now either trying to intimidate me or buy me off. Something inside me, something I didn't even know existed, straightened my spine. Maybe it was Eleanor's blood running through my veins. Or maybe it was just years of struggling to make ends meet while people like the Blackwoods lived in luxury they hadn't earned. "I think I'd like to see the house now," I said, my voice stronger than I felt. My house. The words felt strange coming out of my mouth, but also somehow right. For the first time in my life, I wasn't apologizing for taking up space or asking permission to exist somewhere. As Mr. Harrison led me toward the door, I heard Margaret's voice behind me, cold and sharp as winter wind off Lake Michigan. "This isn't over, Emma. Not by a long shot. You have no idea what you've just inherited, and I don't just mean the money." Mr. Harrison handed me the keys to the mansion with a sympathetic smile. "Take your time getting acquainted with everything," he said quietly. "I'll be in touch tomorrow about the financial accounts and legal paperwork. For now, just try to process all of this. And, Emma?" He paused. glancing back at the Blackwoods who were huddled together in heated conversation. Be careful. Eleanor was very specific about certain concerns she had regarding her late husband's family. After he left, I stood alone in the grand foyer, listening to the silence that felt heavy with decades of secrets. The Blackwoods had stormed out 20 minutes earlier, their threats and protests echoing off the marble floors. Now it was just me and $12.7 million worth of house that smelled like lavender and old books, and something else I couldn't quite identify. Maybe fear, maybe sadness, maybe both. I wandered through the rooms like a ghost, touching expensive furniture and wondering if this was all some elaborate dream I'd wake up from back in my tiny apartment. The kitchen was bigger than my entire living space, with professional-grade appliances and a breakfast nook that overlooked Lake Michigan. The library had floor-to-ceiling bookshelves and one of those rolling ladders I'd only seen in movies. Every room felt like a museum, perfectly preserved but somehow waiting for life to return to it. Eleanor's bedroom was on the second floor, overlooking the lake through tall windows framed by heavy curtains. It was surprisingly simple compared to the rest of the house. White linens, a small writing desk by the window, and photographs covering the dresser. I picked up one of the frames and nearly dropped it. It was me, age 7, gap-toothed and grinning, standing next to my mother at some family gathering I barely remembered. But what shocked me was that Eleanor had kept it all these years, displayed it prominently among her most treasured possessions. There were other photos, too. Me at my high school graduation. How had she even gotten this? Me at my college art show, standing proudly next to a painting I'd forgotten I'd ever created. Pictures spanning decades, documenting a life she supposedly wasn't part of. In every photo, I looked happy, unaware that someone was watching from a distance, caring about my achievements even when I thought no one was paying attention. My hands were shaking as I sat down at her writing desk. That's when I saw it. Eleanor's letter, the one Mr. Harrison had given me, still unopened in my trembling fingers. I carefully broke the wax seal and unfolded the pages, written in that same careful handwriting I remembered from childhood birthday cards. "My dearest Emma," it began, "if you are reading this, then I am gone, and you have inherited far more than money and property. You have inherited a responsibility that I pray you are strong enough to bear." The letter went on to explain that Eleanor had been watching over me my entire life, not from a distance by choice, but because she had been protecting me from something dangerous. The Blackwoods, she wrote, had been systematically stealing from the estate for nearly 20 years, using their position as trustees to embezzle millions of dollars. But the most shocking revelation was yet to come. "Your mother discovered their theft 15 years ago," Eleanor's letter continued. "Anna was always too smart for her own good, too honest to look the other way. She came to me with evidence, bank records she had found while helping me organize my finances. We were going to expose them together, go to the police, make sure they paid for what they had done." My hands were shaking so hard I could barely read the next lines. 3 days before we were supposed to meet with the authorities, your mother died in that car accident. But Emma, it wasn't an accident. I have spent 15 years gathering evidence, and I know the truth. The Blackwoods killed your mother to protect their secret, and they have been threatening me ever since to keep quiet. The letter fell from my hands as the room began to spin. My mother hadn't died in a random accident. She had been murdered, and the people who had just tried to intimidate me into giving up my inheritance were the ones responsible. I picked up the letter with trembling fingers and continued reading. "I am leaving you everything not just because you are my blood, but because you are the only one I trust to finish what your mother and I started. In the safe behind the painting in my study, you will find all the evidence I have gathered. Bank records, photographs, recorded conversations, everything you need to make them pay for what they did to Anna." The letter ended with a warning that made my blood run cold. "Be careful, my dear girl. They killed once to protect their secret. They will not hesitate to kill again." I sat in Eleanor's bedroom as the sun set over Lake Michigan, holding proof that my mother had been murdered and that I was now the target of people who had already killed to protect their crimes. But I wasn't going to run. The Blackwoods had taken my mother from me, and they had stolen 15 years of my life believing their lie. Now they were going to pay for everything they had done. I just had to stay alive long enough to make it happen. I folded Eleanor's letter carefully and slipped it into my purse, my mind racing with the implications of what I'd just learned. My mother hadn't just stumbled upon some financial irregularities. She had uncovered a massive conspiracy that had cost her life, and now I was holding the evidence that could bring down one of Chicago's most prominent families. The study Eleanor had mentioned was on the first floor, a dark paneled room lined with leather-bound books that looked like they hadn't been disturbed in decades. I found the painting she had referenced, a portrait of a stern-looking man who I assumed was Eleanor's late husband, the original Mr. Blackwood. Behind it, just as she had promised, was a wall safe. My hands trembled as I entered the combination Eleanor had written at the bottom of her letter, my mother's birthday. The safe opened with a soft click, revealing manila folders, USB drives, and what looked like a small digital recorder. I pulled everything out and spread it across Eleanor's mahogany desk. The evidence was overwhelming. Bank statements showing regular transfers from Eleanor's accounts to offshore companies controlled by the Blackwoods. Photographs of Charles meeting with men in expensive suits outside downtown banks. Most damning of all, a recorded phone conversation between Margaret and someone named Vincent Torres, discussing what they called the Anna problem. I pressed play on the digital recorder, and Margaret's voice filled the room, cold and calculating. She's getting too close to the truth about the trust fund. We can't let her expose everything we've built over the past decade. A man's voice responded, gravelly and professional. Accidents happen all the time, Mrs. Blackwood. Brake failure, especially in winter weather. Very tragic. Very believable. And you're certain it can't be traced back to us? I've been doing this for 20 years. Your problem will be solved within the week, and no one will ever suspect it was anything other than an unfortunate accident. I had to stop the recording. My mother's voice wasn't on it, but I could picture her discovering the theft, her sense of justice compelling her to do the right thing, even when it put her in danger. She had always been like that, unable to look the other way when she saw something wrong. The folder labeled financial records contained copies of bank statements going back 2 decades, showing a pattern of systematic theft that totaled nearly $8 million. The Blackwoods had been living off Eleanor's money, while playing the role of devoted family members, all while planning to inherit everything when she died. But Eleanor had been smarter than they gave her credit for. She had been gathering evidence for 15 years, building an airtight case against them. And now that evidence was in my hands. My phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. Stop digging, or you'll end up like your mother. I dropped the phone like it had burned me. Through the study window, I could see a black sedan parked across the street, its engine running. As I watched, it slowly drove away. But the message was clear. They were watching me. I quickly gathered all the evidence and stuffed it into a large envelope. Whatever game the Blackwoods had been playing for the past 15 years, I was now the biggest threat to their secret. But I wasn't going to be intimidated into silence like Eleanor had been. The house suddenly felt too big, too exposed. Every shadow seemed to hide a potential threat. Every creak of the old wooden floors made me jump. I needed to get this evidence somewhere safe and figure out my next move. As I headed toward the front door, I noticed something I'd missed earlier. A small security camera mounted discreetly in the corner of the foyer. If Eleanor had been as thorough as her letter suggested, maybe she had been recording everything that happened in the house. I found the security system's control panel hidden behind a painting in the hallway. The digital display showed recordings going back months. My heart raced as I scrolled through the dates, looking for anything that might help me understand what Eleanor had been dealing with in her final weeks. There it was, footage from just 2 weeks ago. Charles Blackwood letting himself into the house with his own key, going straight to Eleanor's safe, and removing several documents. He had been stealing from her even while she was alive, probably trying to destroy evidence of his crimes. But the most damning footage was from 3 months ago. Margaret Blackwood arguing with Eleanor in the very study where I now sat, their voices raised enough that the security system's audio picked up fragments. Should have died with your niece. Won't let you destroy this family. Accidents can happen to anyone. They had threatened Eleanor directly, and now she was dead. I copied the security footage to a USB drive, my hands trembling as I worked. This was evidence of conspiracy, theft, and possibly murder. But it was also my death sentence if the Blackwoods found out I had it. My phone rang, making me nearly jump out of my skin. Unknown number again. Hello, Emma. The voice was smooth, male, unfamiliar. I think we need to talk. Who is this? Someone who knew your aunt very well. Someone who's been waiting for you to find what she left behind. Meet me at Millennium Park tomorrow at noon, by the Bean. Come alone, and bring everything you found in Eleanor's safe. How do you know what Because I helped her gather it. My name is Detective Marcus Rivera, Chicago PD. I've been working this case for 15 years, ever since your mother died. Eleanor was my informant. The line went dead. I stood in Eleanor's study, surrounded by luxury and secrets, holding evidence that could destroy one of Chicago's most prominent families. But I was also holding the key to justice for my mother's murder. Tomorrow, everything would change again. The question was, could I trust Detective Rivera, or was I walking into another trap? Outside, I heard a car door slam. Through the window, I saw the black sedan had returned, and this time, 2 men in dark suits were walking toward the front door. I wasn't safe here anymore. I grabbed the envelope full of evidence and the USB drives, my heart pounding as I heard footsteps on the gravel driveway. The front door was too exposed. Whoever was out there would see me if I tried to leave that way. I remembered seeing a back staircase that led to the kitchen during my earlier exploration of the house. Moving as quietly as possible, I made my way through the darkened hallways, using my phone's flashlight to navigate. The old house seemed to creak with every step, and I was certain whoever was outside could hear me moving around. The kitchen had a door that opened onto a small garden area. I peered through the window and saw the backyard was empty, but I could hear voices coming from the front of the house. At least 2 people, maybe more, and they weren't trying to be quiet anymore. I slipped out the back door and crept along the side of the house, staying low behind the perfectly manicured hedges. Through the front windows, I could see flashlight beams moving around inside. They were searching for something, probably the same evidence I now had clutched against my chest. My car was parked in the circular driveway, completely exposed. There was no way I could reach it without being seen, but I remembered seeing a small gate at the back of the property that led to the neighboring street. If I could make it there, I could call an Uber and get away. The October night was cold, and I was still wearing my funeral dress and thin jacket. I made my way carefully through Eleanor's garden, trying not to trip over the decorative stones that lined the pathways. Behind me, I could hear the intruders moving through the house more aggressively now, no longer trying to be quiet. Furniture was being moved, drawers were being pulled open, and I heard the distinct sound of the safe door slamming shut. They were looking for exactly what I had taken. The gate was locked, but it was an old-fashioned latch that I managed to work open after a few tense minutes of fumbling in the dark. I slipped through onto the quiet residential street and immediately called for a ride, my fingers shaking as I typed in the pickup location. While I waited, I tried to process everything that had happened. My mother hadn't died in a random accident. She'd been murdered because she discovered the Blackwoods were embezzling from Eleanor's estate. Eleanor had spent 15 years gathering evidence, working with a police detective to build a case. And now that evidence was in my hands, making me the next target. The Uber arrived within minutes, and I gave the driver the address of a 24-hour diner downtown. I needed somewhere public and well-lit to think, somewhere the Blackwoods wouldn't expect to find me. As we drove away from the mansion, I saw 3 cars parked outside. The black sedan I'd noticed earlier, plus 2 others. This wasn't just Charles and Margaret looking for documents. This was organized, professional, and terrifying. At the diner, I ordered coffee I didn't want and spread Eleanor's documents across the booth table, keeping one eye on the door. The evidence was overwhelming. Bank records showing systematic theft over nearly 2 decades, photographs of secret meetings, and most damning of all, the recorded conversation between Margaret Blackwood and Vincent Torres discussing my mother's murder. I listened to the recording again through my earbuds, my hands shaking as I heard Margaret's voice. She's getting too close to the truth about the trust fund. We can't let her expose everything we've built. And Torres responding, accidents happen all the time. Brake failure, especially in winter weather. Very tragic, very believable. They had planned it. They had actually sat down and planned my mother's murder like it was a business transaction. I was so absorbed in the documents that I almost didn't notice the man who'd entered the diner and was now sitting at the counter, occasionally glancing in my direction. He was trying to look casual, but something about his posture screamed surveillance. I quickly gathered the papers and headed for the restroom, taking my purse with me. There was a small window that looked out onto the alley behind the diner. It was a tight fit, but I managed to squeeze through and drop down onto the pavement behind a dumpster. My phone showed it was almost 3 a.m. I had 9 hours until my meeting with Detective Rivera, assuming he was really who he claimed to be. I needed somewhere safe to hide until then. somewhere the Blackwoods would never think to look. That's when I remembered my old college roommate, Jessica, who lived in a studio apartment in Wicker Park. We'd lost touch over the years, but she'd always said I could crash at her place if I ever needed to. I called another Uber and spent the ride staring out the back window, watching for any cars that might be following us. The city looked different at this hour. Emptier, more dangerous, full of shadows where threats could hide. By the time I reached Jessica's building, I'd made a decision. I wasn't going to run from this. The Blackwoods had killed my mother and gotten away with it for 15 years. They'd stolen millions from Eleanor and probably hastened her death with their threats and intimidation. But they'd made one crucial mistake. They'd underestimated me. Tomorrow I would meet Detective Rivera and turn over the evidence. And then I would make sure the Blackwoods paid for everything they'd done. I just had to survive until noon. Jessica answered her door in pajamas, her hair a mess, but she took one look at my face and pulled me inside without asking questions. That's what I'd always loved about her. She had an instinct for when someone needed help. No questions asked. "Emma, what the hell is going on? You look like you've seen a ghost." "Something like that," I said, collapsing onto her couch. "Jess, I need to ask you a huge favor. Can I stay here for a few hours? And can you not tell anyone I'm here? Anyone at all?" She studied my face for a moment, then nodded. "Of course. But you're going to tell me what's going on, right?" I looked at my oldest friend, sitting cross-legged on her coffee table in her ridiculous unicorn pajamas, and realized I couldn't drag her into this. The Blackwoods had already killed once to protect their secret. I couldn't risk Jessica's life, too. "It's complicated," I said finally, "but I promise I'll explain everything soon. I just need a safe place to think for a few hours." Jessica made me tea and gave me a blanket, then curled up in her bed while I tried to rest on the couch. But sleep was impossible. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw my mother's face, heard Margaret Blackwood's cold voice planning her murder. At 11 a.m., I gathered my things and prepared to leave for my meeting with Detective Rivera. Jessica was at work, but she'd left me a note. "Whatever you're dealing with, you're stronger than you think. Call me when you can." I took the L train to downtown, the envelope of evidence hidden in my oversized purse. Millennium Park was crowded with tourists and office workers on their lunch breaks, which made me feel slightly safer. Surely the Blackwoods wouldn't try anything in such a public place. The Bean, officially called Cloudgate, reflected the Chicago skyline in its polished surface. I found a bench nearby and waited, watching every person who approached, looking for someone who might be Detective Rivera. At exactly noon, a man in his 50s approached me. He was Hispanic, with graying hair and tired eyes that had seen too much. He wore a rumpled suit and carried himself with the weary authority of a longtime cop. "Emma Rodriguez?" he asked quietly. I nodded, my hand instinctively moving to protect the envelope in my purse. "I'm Detective Rivera. We need to talk." The first thing Detective Rivera said wasn't, "I'm sorry for your loss," or "You're in danger." It was, "Your mother was the bravest person I ever met, and she died because she refused to let evil people get away with their crimes." Detective Marcus Rivera looked exactly like what I'd imagined a 15-year veteran of the Chicago Police Department would look like. Weathered face, tired eyes that had seen too much, and the kind of quiet intensity that comes from carrying unsolved cases like personal burdens. He sat down on the bench beside me, close enough to speak quietly, but far enough away that I didn't feel trapped. "I know you don't have any reason to trust me," he said, his voice carrying a slight accent that reminded me of my father. "For all you know, I could be working with the Blackwoods, but I'm going to tell you some things that only your mother and Eleanor knew, things that will prove I'm on your side." I clutched my purse tighter, feeling the weight of the evidence inside. Around us, tourists were taking selfies with the Bean, completely oblivious to the life-and-death conversation happening on a park bench just a few feet away. "Your mother came to me in January of 2009, Rivera continued, staring out at the Chicago skyline reflected in the sculpture's surface. She had discovered discrepancies in Eleanor's financial records while helping her organize some paperwork. At first, she thought it was just accounting errors, but the more she dug, the more she realized it was systematic theft. He pulled out a worn notebook from his jacket pocket, the kind detectives use to record witness statements and case notes. Anna was scared, but she was also angry. She said the Blackwoods had been treating Eleanor like their personal ATM for years, taking advantage of an elderly woman's trust. She wanted to do the right thing, even though she knew it would be dangerous. "Why didn't you arrest them then?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Rivera's expression darkened. "Because we needed more evidence. Financial crimes like this are complicated, especially when the perpetrators are wealthy and connected. We needed bank records, documentation, proof that would hold up in court. Your mother was going to help us get it." He flipped through several pages of his notebook, and I could see my mother's name written at the top of several entries. We had a plan. Anna was going to copy more financial documents during her next visit to Eleanor's house. We were going to meet on February 15th to go over everything and decide how to proceed. February 12th. The date was burned into my memory. That was the day my mother died. 3 days before our meeting, I got the call about the accident. Rivera continued, his voice heavy with old grief. "Single car crash on Lakeshore Drive. Brake failure, they said. Very tragic. Very believable. But you didn't believe it. I'm a cop, Emma. I don't believe in coincidences, especially when someone dies 3 days before they're supposed to testify about a major financial crime." He closed the notebook and looked directly at me. "I requested the accident report, had the car examined by an independent mechanic. The brake lines had been cut, but it was done so skillfully that it looked like normal wear and tear unless you knew exactly what to look for." My hands were shaking now. Hearing the details of how they'd killed my mother made it real in a way that Eleanor's letter hadn't. "Why didn't you pursue it? Why didn't you arrest them?" Rivera's laugh was bitter. "With what evidence? Your mother was dead, and all the financial documents she'd gathered were conveniently destroyed in an accidental fire at her apartment 2 days after the funeral. The Blackwoods had covered their tracks perfectly. I remembered that fire. The landlord had said it was faulty wiring, and I'd been too devastated by my mother's death to question it. Now I realized it had been another murder, the murder of evidence that could have brought her killers to justice. So I went to Eleanor," Rivera continued, "told her what I suspected, what your mother had discovered. At first she didn't want to believe it. The Blackwoods were family, she said. They'd been taking care of her for years. But she came around. It took time, but yes. Eleanor was a smart woman, and once she started looking at her finances with suspicious eyes, she saw the same patterns your mother had noticed. That's when she decided to help me build a case against them." Rivera pulled out his phone and showed me a photo of Eleanor sitting in what looked like a police station conference room. She was older than I remembered, but her eyes were sharp and determined. For 15 years, Eleanor gathered evidence. Bank statements, recorded conversations, photographs of meetings. She documented everything, knowing that someday she'd have enough to bring them down. He put the phone away. She also knew they were getting suspicious. The threats started about 6 months ago. What kind of threats? Phone calls in the middle of the night. Cars following her when she went out. Margaret Blackwood started visiting more frequently, always asking about Eleanor's will, about her plans for the estate. Rivera's jaw tightened. Eleanor was scared, but she was also stubborn. She said she owed it to your mother to see this through. I thought about Eleanor's letter, about how she'd been watching over me my entire life while building a case against my mother's killers. She left me everything because she knew I'd finish what she started. That's exactly right. Eleanor knew that if something happened to her, you'd be the only person she could trust with the evidence. The only person who'd care enough about justice for Anna to see this through, no matter how dangerous it got. Rivera leaned forward, his voice urgent. "Emma, I need you to know what you're up against. The Blackwoods aren't just thieves. They're killers. They've murdered 2 people to protect their secret, and they won't hesitate to kill again. If you have Eleanor's evidence, you're in serious danger." I looked around the park, suddenly aware of how exposed we were. "They already know I have it. Someone broke into the house last night, and I've been getting threatening texts. Then we need to move fast." Rivera stood up, his hand moving instinctively to where his gun would be holstered under his jacket. "Do you have the evidence with you?" I nodded, patting my purse. "Good. We're going to walk to the police station right now, and you're going to turn everything over to me. Then we're going to put you in protective custody until we can arrest the Blackwoods." "Wait." I stood up too, but something was bothering me. "If you've been investigating this for 15 years, why haven't you been able to build a case? Why do you need Eleanor's evidence?" Rivera's expression shifted slightly, and for the first time since we'd started talking, he looked uncomfortable. "Because I'm not officially investigating this case, Emma. The Blackwoods have connections throughout the city government, including the police department. When I tried to pursue the investigation after your mother's death, I was told to drop it. Lack of evidence, they said. No point in harassing prominent citizens over conspiracy theories. So you've been working alone for 15 years. Eleanor was my only ally, and now she's gone. He looked directly at me, and I could see the weight of all those years in his eyes. You're my last chance to get justice for your mother and Eleanor, but I can't protect you if you don't trust me. I studied his face, looking for any sign of deception. Everything he'd told me matched what I'd learned from Eleanor's letter and the evidence I'd found. But 15 years was a long time to carry a grudge, and I'd learned not to trust anyone completely. If I give you the evidence, what happens next? I take it to the FBI. Financial crimes that cross state lines fall under federal jurisdiction, and the Blackwoods have been moving money through offshore accounts. The feds won't be influenced by local political connections. It made sense, but something still felt wrong. How do I know you won't just disappear with the evidence? How do I know you're really who you say you are? Rivera reached into his wallet and pulled out his police badge, along with a business card. Call the station. Ask for Detective Rivera in the Cold Case Division. They'll confirm I'm real. I took out my phone and dialed the number on the card. A bored-sounding desk sergeant confirmed that Detective Rivera was indeed a real person and was currently on duty. Satisfied? Rivera asked when I hung up. I was about to answer when I saw something that made my blood run cold. Across the park, near the entrance, I spotted Charles Blackwood talking on his phone. He was scanning the crowd, clearly looking for someone. Looking for me. We need to go, I said urgently. Now. Rivera followed my gaze and immediately understood. This way. Stay close to me and try to look casual. We started walking toward the opposite end of the park, but I could see Charles moving in our direction. He'd spotted us. Run, Rivera said quietly. We broke into a sprint, weaving between tourists and street performers. Behind us, I could hear Charles shouting into his phone, probably calling for backup. The station is 6 blocks north, Rivera called out as we ran. If we can make it there, you'll be safe. But as we reached the street, I saw 2 black sedans racing toward us from opposite directions. We were trapped. The moment I saw those black sedans racing toward us from both directions, I realized that Detective Rivera and I weren't just running from the Blackwoods. We were running for our lives. Rivera grabbed my arm and pulled me toward a crowded food truck area where dozens of office workers were lined up for lunch. Stay low and follow my lead, he whispered urgently. We need to get lost in the crowd. The sedans screeched to a halt at the park entrance, and I could see men in dark suits getting out. They weren't trying to be subtle anymore. This was a full-scale manhunt in broad daylight in downtown Chicago. Charles Blackwood was pointing in our direction, his face red with rage even from a distance. This way, Rivera said, leading me through the maze of food trucks and outdoor seating areas. We ducked behind a large hot dog cart just as one of the men in suits jogged past, speaking rapidly into a radio. How many people do they have? I whispered, clutching my purse with Eleanor's evidence against my chest. Too many, Rivera replied grimly. The Blackwoods have been planning for this possibility for years. They probably have a whole team on standby for situations like this. We crept along behind the row of food trucks, using them as cover while we made our way toward the street. But every exit seemed to be watched. I counted at least 6 men in suits positioned around the park's perimeter, all of them scanning the crowd with the methodical precision of professionals. Detective Rivera, I said quietly, if they're willing to do this in public, in front of hundreds of witnesses, what does that tell us about how desperate they are? His expression was grim. It tells us they're planning to clean up all the loose ends today. You, me, and anyone else who knows the truth about what they've done. A chill ran down my spine. These weren't just white-collar criminals trying to cover up financial fraud. These were people who had killed twice and were prepared to kill again, to protect their secret. Rivera's phone buzzed with a text message. He glanced at it, and his face went pale. Emma, we have a problem. That text is from my partner at the station. The Blackwoods just filed a complaint claiming you stole valuable documents from Eleanor's house. They have a warrant for your arrest. What? But the house is mine. Eleanor left it to me. It doesn't matter. They're claiming the documents were stolen before the will was read, which would make it theft from the estate. It's a legal technicality, but it means every cop in the city is now looking for you. I felt like the ground was shifting beneath my feet. Not only were the Blackwoods trying to kill me, but they'd also managed to turn the entire Chicago Police Department against me. So we can't go to the police station. Not anymore. We need a different plan. Rivera was scanning the crowd, looking for an escape route. The FBI field office is downtown, about 10 blocks from here. If we can get there, we can turn over the evidence and get you into federal protection. 10 blocks? With half of Chicago looking for us? It's our only option. The feds won't be influenced by whatever strings the Blackwoods are pulling locally. We made our way to the edge of the food truck area, staying low and moving carefully. The street beyond was busy with lunch hour traffic, which would provide cover, but also make us more visible to the men searching for us. On my count, Rivera said, we're going to walk out of here like we belong. Don't run. Don't look back. Just walk normally toward that bus stop across the street. What if they see us? Then we run like hell. We stepped out onto the sidewalk, and for a moment, I thought we might actually make it. The crowd was thick, and we blended in with the stream of pedestrians heading back to their offices after lunch. But then I heard a shout behind us. There, by the bus stop. Run, Rivera said. We sprinted across the street, dodging cars and ignoring the angry honks of drivers. Behind us, I could hear footsteps pounding on the pavement and more shouting. The men chasing us weren't trying to be subtle anymore. Rivera led me down a side street lined with small shops and restaurants. In here, he said, pulling me into a crowded coffee shop. We pushed through the line of customers and headed for the back exit, but one of the baristas called out, "Hey, you can't just—" "Police business," Rivera said, flashing his badge. "Emergency exit." We burst through the back door into an alley that smelled like garbage and stale coffee. Rivera immediately turned left, leading me toward what looked like a maze of narrow passages between buildings. "Where are we going?" I asked, trying to keep up with his longer strides. I grew up in this neighborhood. I know every alley, every shortcut. If we can stay ahead of them for a few more blocks, we can lose them in the crowd near Union Station. We ran through a series of connected alleys, jumping over dumpsters and dodging delivery trucks. My funeral dress wasn't exactly designed for parkour, and my heels were making it nearly impossible to keep up. But every time I thought about slowing down, I remembered Margaret Blackwood's voice on that recording, coldly planning my mother's murder. "Emma," Rivera called back to me. "Whatever happens, don't let them get that evidence. It's the only thing that can bring them down." "What do you mean, whatever happens?" But before he could answer, we turned a corner and found ourselves face to face with two of the men in suits. They were blocking the alley exit, and behind us, I could hear more footsteps approaching. We were trapped. "Detective Rivera," one of the men said in a calm, professional voice, "and Miss Rodriguez, you've led us quite a chase." Rivera stepped in front of me, his hand moving toward his gun. "Federal agents?" The man smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Private security. The Blackwood family is very concerned about Miss Rodriguez's mental state. She's been under a lot of stress since her aunt's death, and they're worried she might hurt herself or others. That's bullshit and you know it. Is it? She broke into a private residence, stole valuable documents, and has been making wild accusations about a respected family. Sounds like someone having a breakdown to me." I could see Rivera calculating our options. The alley was narrow, with brick walls on both sides and no way out except through the men blocking our path. "What do you want?" I asked, surprised by how steady my voice sounded. "Just the documents you took from the house. Return them, and this all goes away. You can go back to your little apartment, your little job, your little life. No one gets hurt. Except you've already hurt people. You killed my mother." The man's expression didn't change. "I don't know what you're talking about. Your mother died in a car accident 15 years ago. Very tragic. The brake lines were cut. Prove it." That's when I realized the truth. These people weren't just criminals. They were professionals who had been covering up crimes for decades. They had lawyers, connections, resources that I couldn't even imagine. Even if I turned over the evidence, they would find a way to discredit it, to make it disappear. But they had made one mistake. They had underestimated how far I was willing to go to get justice for my mother. I pulled out my phone and held it up so they could see the screen. I've already uploaded copies of everything to the cloud. Bank records, recordings, photographs. If anything happens to me, it all gets sent automatically to the FBI, the Chicago Tribune, and every major news outlet in the city. It was a bluff. I hadn't had time to upload anything, but the man's confident expression flickered for just a moment. You're lying. Try me. Rivera caught on immediately. She's not the scared little girl you think she is. Emma Rodriguez is Ana Rodriguez's daughter, and she's just as stubborn and just as brave as her mother was. The standoff stretched for what felt like hours, but was probably only seconds. Then one of the men reached inside his jacket, and I knew our time was up. Get down, Rivera shouted, drawing his gun. The alley exploded into chaos. The gunshot echoed off the brick walls like thunder, and in that split second before I hit the ground, I realized that everything, my mother's death, Eleanor's murder, 15 years of lies, was about to end in this dirty alley behind a coffee shop. Rivera's shot went wide, but it was enough to send the two men diving for cover behind a dumpster. Stay down, he yelled to me as he pressed himself against the brick wall, his gun trained on their position. I crawled behind a pile of cardboard boxes, my heart hammering so hard I was sure everyone in a 3-block radius could hear it. The envelope with Eleanor's evidence was still clutched in my hands, and I realized that these documents, these pieces of paper, were worth more than my life to the people hunting us. This doesn't have to end badly, one of the men called out from behind the dumpster. Just give us what we want, and everyone walks away. Like my mother walked away? I shouted back, surprised by the anger in my own voice. Like Eleanor walked away? Rivera caught my eye and mouthed the word phone. I understood immediately. While he kept them pinned down, I could call for help. But as I reached for my phone, I heard the sound of footsteps at both ends of the alley. More men were arriving, cutting off our escape routes. Detective Rivera? A familiar voice called out. Charles Blackwood stepped into view at the far end of the alley, flanked by 2 more men in suits. This has gone far enough. You're outnumbered and outgunned. Surrender now, and we can discuss this like civilized people. Civilized people don't murder innocent women, Rivera replied, not taking his eyes off the men behind the dumpster. Charles laughed, but there was no humor in it. Murder? Detective, I think you've been listening to too many conspiracy theories. Ana Rodriguez died in a car accident. Eleanor Blackwood died of natural causes. These are facts, documented by the proper authorities. Facts you paid to have documented, I said, standing up slowly with my hands visible. If this was going to end, I wanted to face it on my feet. I have the recordings, Charles. I know about Vincent Torres. I know about the brake lines. For the first time since this nightmare began, Charles Blackwood looked genuinely surprised. Recordings? What recordings? I pulled out Eleanor's digital recorder and held it up. 15 years of conversations. Margaret discussing my mother's murder. You talking about covering it up. All of it. The color drained from Charles's face. That's impossible. We destroyed everything after Eleanor died. Eleanor was smarter than you gave her credit for. She made copies of everything and hid them where you'd never think to look. I was improvising now, but I could see the doubt creeping into his expression. Even if such recordings existed, Charles said, trying to regain his composure, they would be inadmissible in court. Illegally obtained evidence. Maybe in criminal court, Rivera said, but not in the court of public opinion. How do you think your social standing will survive when the Chicago Tribune runs the headline, "Prominent Family Linked to Double Murder"? That's when I saw my opening. While Charles was focused on Rivera, I quietly activated the voice memo app on my phone and slipped it into my jacket pocket, making sure the microphone was exposed. You know what, Charles? I said loudly. You're right. Maybe the recordings won't hold up in court. Maybe you have enough money and connections to make this all go away. But I'm not my mother. I'm not going to quietly disappear because you find me inconvenient. What are you saying? I'm saying that if you want to kill me, you're going to have to do it right here, right now, in broad daylight in downtown Chicago. And when you do, everyone is going to know exactly who you are and what you've done. Charles stepped closer, his mask of civility finally slipping completely. You stupid girl. Do you have any idea how much money is at stake here? How many people depend on the Blackwood family's continued success? Your mother was a nobody who stumbled onto something she didn't understand, and she paid the price for her curiosity. So you admit it. You killed her. I didn't kill anyone. But yes, Ana Rodriguez's death was necessary. Just like Eleanor's death was necessary. Just like yours will be necessary. Rivera was staring at me with a mixture of admiration and horror. He could see what I was doing, getting Charles to confess on tape. But he also knew it was incredibly dangerous. "And how exactly are you planning to explain my death?" I asked. "Another convenient accident?" "Suicide," Charles said matter-of-factly. "Distraught young woman, overwhelmed by grief and financial pressure, takes her own life. Very tragic. The family will even pay for a nice funeral. You've thought this through. We've had 15 years to think it through. Every possible scenario, every potential threat. You're not the first person to stumble onto our business arrangements, Emma. You're just the most persistent." I could feel my phone recording everything, capturing Charles Blackwood's confession to multiple murders. But I also knew that if I didn't survive the next few minutes, the recording would die with me. "There's just one problem with your plan," I said. "What's that?" "I'm not alone." Charles frowned. "Detective Rivera is hardly—" "Not Rivera. Them." I pointed behind Charles, and he turned to see a team of FBI agents in tactical gear moving into position at both ends of the alley. Rivera was grinning now, and I realized he'd been buying time for backup to arrive. "Federal agents!" one of them shouted through a megaphone. "Drop your weapons and put your hands where we can see them." The men in suits looked to Charles for orders, but he was staring at the FBI agents like he couldn't quite believe what he was seeing. "How?" he asked. Rivera holstered his gun and pulled out his phone. "I've been working with the feds for months, building a case against your family. Emma's evidence was just the final piece we needed. And thanks to her little recording session just now, we have your full confession." I pulled my phone out of my pocket and held it up, the voice memo app still running. "Every word, Charles, including the part where you admitted to murdering my mother and Eleanor." The FBI agents moved in quickly, surrounding the men in suits and ordering them to the ground. Charles Blackwood, one of Chicago's most prominent citizens, was handcuffed and read his rights in a dirty alley behind a coffee shop. As they led him away, he looked back at me one last time. "This isn't over, Emma. My family has resources you can't imagine. Lawyers, connections, influence. We'll fight this." "Good luck with that," I said. "But you're forgetting something important." "What's that?" "I'm Anna Rodriguez's daughter, and we don't give up." 3 months later, I stood in a federal courthouse in downtown Chicago, watching as Charles Blackwood was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Margaret Blackwood had already pled guilty to conspiracy and murder charges in exchange for a reduced sentence. The entire Blackwood criminal enterprise had collapsed like a house of cards once the evidence became public. Eleanor's mansion was mine now, legally and completely. I'd sold it and used the money to establish the Ana Rodriguez Foundation, providing legal aid to families who couldn't afford to fight powerful people who had wronged them. Detective Rivera had been promoted and was now heading up a new task force investigating cold cases involving wealthy defendants. He'd become something like a father figure to me, the family I'd never known I needed. As I walked out of the courthouse that day, I felt my mother's presence with me. Justice had finally been served, 15 years late, but not too late. The Blackwoods had thought they could murder their way to wealth and respectability, but they'd forgotten one crucial thing. The truth has a way of surviving, even when the people who know it don't. And sometimes, just sometimes, the good guys actually win.